As a former police officer, I believe that the prohibition of marijuana is one of the most ridiculous abuses of our allocation of police staff and money that we could possibly have.
The great myth of prohibition is that prohibition doesn't mean you control drugs. It means you give up the right to control drugs.
Of course, I don't want to find marijuana in my daughter's room, but I'd certainly not want to see her arrested and with a criminal record the rest of her life.
The most dangerous thing about marijuana is to be arrested for its possession or use.
Welcome to the program. I'm Rick Steves, travel writer and your host. I've found that challenging one's own preconceived notions and engaging in open and honest conversations with others is one of the beauties of travel. In fact, it's fundamental to good travel. Today, I'll take you and our studio audience on a guided tour through the history of this country's marijuana laws. Along the way, we'll learn about the fascinating people and events that are responsible for the marijuana laws we live with today. We'll also hear from scientists and doctors, police officers and judges, and people just like you who are questioning whether those laws are working for us or actually working against us.
I've been a medical marijuana patient for about 2.5 months now. I started using it because of the effects I was having from my chemotherapy and my surgery after my ovarian cancer was diagnosed. I have not taken any opiates in over 2 months. I haven't taken any of their prescribed anti-nausea drugs. Since I've been in chemotherapy, I've had chemo nurses who've asked me that I've told that I was a medical marijuana patient and have asked me for information because they've had other patients ask them and they have no information. I think there's a lot of fear among the medical community. I think there's a lot of misinformation. And it's, because it is the drug war. And a lot of people are just scared of touching it, just want to, distance themselves as much as possible from it just because of the legal issues.
Carolyn lives in one of the 13 states that have passed laws permitting the medical use of marijuana.
Well, if she lives in a medical marijuana state, then why are her doctors and nurses afraid to talk to her about it?
That's a great question, and it's best answered by one of our guest panelists. Joining us are Deborah Small, who's the founder and executive director of the national drug policy organization called Break the Chains, retired Superior Court Judge David Nichols, and Alison Holcomb, director of the American Civil Liberties Union's Marijuana Education Project. Alison, why don't we start with you? Why would Carolyn's doctors and nurses be afraid to talk to her about medical use of marijuana if she lives in a state where it's already legal?
The short answer, Rick, is the federal government. There are now 13 states that have passed medical marijuana laws, but the federal government doesn't recognize them. In those states, patients that want to use medical marijuana are threatened and harassed by the federal government, and the doctors that would authorize it for them are too scared to. For people like Carolyn, it's a very big problem.
And it's really ironic because since 1978, our government has been giving, the federal government has been giving medical marijuana to patients, but at the same time, this federal government is also attacking state medical marijuana laws and the people who choose to try to implement them. It's an incredible hypocrisy that's caused great hardship on a number of people around the country.
Federal drug marijuana laws are not based on science. It's intentional government ignorance, I think, put out there. And Dr. Lyle Craker from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst is involved in a long legal hassle. I finally got a decision allowing him to proceed with his research, but the Drug Enforcement Administration continues to stonewall the research.
We visited Professor Craker, the man at the center of this controversy.
My name is Lyle Craker. I'm a professor at the Department of Plant and Soil Sciences in the University of Massachusetts. Our primary research and educational outreach is in medicinal plants. One of the key plants that we've been working with is black cohosh. Currently, this plant is collected in the Appalachian region and sold commercially as a dietary supplement. for use by menopausal women to relieve the symptoms of menopause. 25 or 30% of the current medicines on the market are plants or plant-derived. I look at marijuana as no different than any other medicinal plant we've worked with. And what we want to do is to do the best thing for the public. And the best thing for the public is to do the research to see, to either prove yes or prove no that this plant material has beneficial health effects. To me, this is no different than anything else we've looked at, except that we're restricted. We can't look at it, and that's the big problem. I think that the point we're getting at is that we only learn about how plants can be used is if we do the scientific research that's necessary. And whether we're talking about black cohosh or we're talking about medical marijuana, we're talking about the same type of procedures that we scientifically need to do.
The first law governing marijuana required all farmers in the Virginia colony to actually grow hemp, the fiber produced by the marijuana plant. Hemp was valuable because you could use its fibers for rope and canvas, its seeds for soap and lamp oil. Most of the sails and ropes on colonial ships were made from hemp, as were many of the colonists' clothing, maps, and even Bibles. Both the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution were written on hemp parchment.
In 1850, marijuana is put in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. Doctors are using and prescribing marijuana in the United States beginning in the 1850s. It is sold by the legitimate drug companies.
And marijuana policy remained that way for almost a century. Then along came Harry J. Anslinger. He earned his living chasing rum runners during Prohibition. He became commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930. At that time, it was becoming apparent that Prohibition was losing public support, and Anslinger shifted his focus from alcohol to marijuana. Anslinger utilized the press, whipping up public hysteria with exaggerated claims of the evils of the devil weed.
There's no doubt, I think, when you look at this history, that the enactment of marijuana prohibition, both at the state level and then at the national level, was not based on science at all. The story of Harry Anslinger's role in the prohibition of marijuana and the criminalization of marijuana users is a very interesting story. It's almost comical when you go back and you read some of the newspaper accounts and some of the rhetoric surrounding the prohibition of marijuana to see these incredibly exaggerated assertions, such as that marijuana would take normal people upon smoking it and make them assassins overnight, or that inevitably it would lead to insanity, in a larger sense to debauchery and immorality. What Anslinger did is basically sort of assemble all these forces and kind of harness all this energy against marijuana as the assassin of youth and use it as the tool for promoting the adoption of the Uniform Narcotic Drug Act. And it worked.
A few years later, Anslinger would achieve his ultimate goal, the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937.
The Marijuana Tax Act was passed at the national level in 1937. And that the story about the prohibition of marijuana was basically a story emerging in the 1930s and largely driven by Harry Anslinger.
New immigrant populations were changing the face of American society, and alcohol prohibition had given rise to organized crime and increased violence. Anslinger played the race card and the fear card, as politicians so often have in America, and it worked.
50% of the violent crimes committed in districts occupied by Mexicans, Greeks, Turks, Filipinos, Spaniards, Latin Americans, and Negroes may be traced to the use of marijuana. I believe in some cases one cigarette might develop a homicidal mania, probably to kill his brother. If the hideous monster Frankenstein came face to face with the monster marijuana, he would drop dead of fright. Harry J. Anslinger.
To learn more and to obtain a free copy of the informational booklet, Marijuana, It's Time for a Conversation, please visit marijuanaconversation.org. During the hearings before Congress on the Marijuana Tax Act, the lone dissenting voice was Dr. William Woodward of the American Medical Association. Dr. Woodward pointed out that all of Anslinger's testimony was based on hearsay and exaggerated newspaper editorials, and that Congress had not been presented one single shred of actual evidence of marijuana's supposed dangers. Harry Anslinger remained head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics from 1930 until 1962.
And in those 30 years, he was pretty busy building up his bureaucracy, primarily because he wanted to protect the jobs of all of the alcohol prohibition agents who no longer had work to do after alcohol prohibition was repealed. So a lot of his anti-marijuana propaganda was designed to make sure that there would be full employment for them.
You know, and ironically, even though he's building that bureaucracy all that time and starting to put into place these very harsh penalties and harsh sentences, the popularity of marijuana was continuing to grow, especially in the 60s, when it all of a sudden became a political symbol for unrest and civil disobedience.
So how does Nixon react? His popularity is slipping. He's got people parading in the streets about the war. So he drops one war, takes up a new one.
That's right. In 1970, President Nixon appointed a blue ribbon panel to study the impact of marijuana on our society. It was commonly known as the Schaefer Commission, named after the Republican governor of Pennsylvania who chaired the panel. But the Schaefer Commission made some unexpected recommendations.
There is a commission that is supposed to make recommendations to me about this subject.
It became apparent how little was really known about the effects of this drug and how little evidence there was to support the claims about its dangers. The way that we framed it was that there was no current evidence that occasional use, moderate use, which some called recreational use, of marijuana by basically psychologically healthy people was harmful.
The recommendation of the Commission in its first report is that we do not feel that private use or private possession in one's own home should have the stigma of criminalization, that people who experiment should not be criminalized for that particular behavior.
Eventually, we had endorsements from the American Bar Association, from the American Medical Association, from the American Public Health Association, the National Education Association. I'm sure there were many, many others. But mainstream institutions in American society said, yes, this is the right way to go about dealing with this problem. And eventually, over the period from 1973 to 1977, you had 12 states that actually did adopt the Commission's recommendation and decriminalized it.
President Nixon just wasn't happy with the Schaefer Commission's findings.
No, he wasn't, because he had appointed a number of conservatives to the commission, expecting that they would give him information that would justify his calling for a war on drugs. But instead, they came back and recommended decriminalizing marijuana. He did not expect that, nor did he expect that so many of the country's experts and professional associations would agree with that recommendation.
I think we have a question from our audience. Yeah.
Yes, exactly what does decriminalization mean?
The term decriminalization typically means that you don't get arrested, you don't wind up with any sort of criminal record. And in some states, there can be no penalty whatsoever for the private possession of small amounts of marijuana by adults. In other states, you might have to pay a civil fine like you would for a parking ticket.
You know, there was a prior study back in 1938. Mayor LaGuardia of New York commissioned this study on marijuana because he had been acquainted with an Army study while he was in the House of Representatives. And in 1944, that study was published saying that, in fact, marijuana was a relatively harmless substance.
So twice in recent history, back in the 40s and then with Nixon, politicians have taken information and discarded it and put out false information on marijuana to further their political needs. What happens to the legal system when something like this goes on?
Well, the result is a loss of respect for the law. And Mayor LaGuardia understood that when he worked so hard for the repeal of Prohibition.
Prohibition cannot be enforced for the simple reason that the majority of American people do not want it enforced and are resisting its enforcement. That being so, the orderly thing to do under our form of government is to abolish a law which cannot be enforced, a law which the people of the country do not want enforced.
In the 1980s, "just say no" became the new phrase of an old propaganda campaign. But it wasn't just Republicans beating the drum of war. In 1986, Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill, a Democrat, saw getting tough on crime as a means for his party to win the upcoming elections.
In the 1980s, I was the attorney in the U.S. House of Representatives, principally responsible for writing the drug laws. In the only time in my 10 years at the House of Representatives, we had a bill that we were considering that had never been introduced. There were no hearings. There was no expert input from the Justice Department, from the federal judges, from the Bureau of Prisons. We were literally flying blind. And this legislation ended up creating long mandatory minimums of 10 years mandatory up to life imprisonment when the prior maximum had been 20 years. To say that you deserve up to a year in prison to possess marijuana, that is, to possess it for the purpose of using it, is preposterous. It's totally unjust. How these sentences get imposed is completely random on one hand, and on the other is very much related to what your social class or race is. These laws fundamentally fail the test of justice. As I look back on it, as 30 years as a lawyer, this has been, if this were intentional, this would be the most shameful thing I could imagine somebody doing as a lawyer. It's terrible. It's terrible to live with. That's why, it's critically important, I think, that people like me speak out and say, these laws are wrong, they're counterproductive, they're unjust.
I live in a state that passed a medical marijuana law in the late 90s. My partner and I care for people living with AIDS, and part of that care is providing them with marijuana. Having a warrant served is one of the scariest things that I've ever experienced. Having the battering ram at the door at dawn, jumping out of bed, opening the door, seeing the police there, swarming into the house, handcuffing us while we watch them tear our house apart. We live in fear of losing everything again.
I was in my last year of law school and I was convicted of a federal marijuana felony. I had to plead guilty in a plea bargain. I had a house arrest sentence and 5 years probation. I will not be able to run for public office. I have 2 wonderful kids. I will need to explain to them why I can't vote for the rest of my life, why we can't cross the border. I feel like I have a brand for the rest of my life, and I can't get rid of it.
I spent 26 years in the New Jersey State Police. 14 of those years I was undercover in narcotics. As a former police officer, I believe that the prohibition of marijuana is one of the most ridiculous abuses of our allocation of police staff and money that we could possibly have. We could be allocating our resources toward protecting folks from violent criminals, from child molesters, from drunk drivers, people who are going to kill people. People who are using marijuana are not violent people. Ask any cop whether they would rather go on a call where they know people are high on marijuana or whether they would rather go on a call where people are high on alcohol. They'll choose marijuana every time.
In 2005, the Sentencing Project, a national research organization focused on sentencing laws and incarceration, issued a report that looked at the war on drugs during the 1990s. We talked to one of its authors about their findings.
What was so surprising that came out of this study was to find the level of resources that were dedicated to pursuing low-level marijuana offenses. I think conventional wisdom across the country is that our drug war is going after importers, and high-level dealers, distributors, and that the federal system, which is designed specifically to bring the rich natural resources to bear upon international and high-level drug trafficking, that in fact, very large proportion of these resources were being funneled towards low-level drug users and people in possession of primarily marijuana. In fact, what the war on drugs really looks like is shaking down kids in the street, grabbing people pulled over on the side of the road, and finding very, very small quantities of marijuana, bringing them into the system, filling out paperwork, a couple of hours of law enforcement time dedicated to paperwork. And I think that most Americans have no idea that that is where their very precious resources are being directed.
Judge Nichols, you were a trial court judge for 20 years. What does the prohibition on marijuana look like from a judge's perspective?
We're using the criminal justice system to address what is essentially a public health issue has served to just clog the courts with all kinds of cases. They put everybody in the criminal justice system to work when they should be addressing far more serious issues, in my opinion.
We have arrested over 800,000 people for marijuana offenses in the last year. And while those 800,000 simple, small-time arrests are occurring, we could be addressing instead the hundreds of thousands of very serious offenses that our law enforcement dollars could be going toward.
And you know, Rick, the consequences of these hundreds of thousands of marijuana arrests go far beyond the impact on the court and our judicial system. It also goes into the communities and affects people in a very negative way. It's interesting because when you look at the states that actually decriminalized marijuana in the 70s, they did it in part because they were concerned about the stigmatization that came along with a criminal record, the fact that it would act as an impediment to people being able to get a job and go to college and even rent an apartment. They wanted to reduce that, and that was why they decriminalized it. But yet we see 20 years, 30 years later that there's a huge amount of marijuana law enforcement, and unfortunately, as with all other aspects of our drug policies, these harms are being inflicted disproportionately on communities of color, particularly African American communities. While African Americans make up about 14% of the people who smoke marijuana or use marijuana, compared to 74% of whites who use it regularly, we represent 30% of the people who are arrested and convicted and acquire criminal records because of marijuana use.
Doesn't even the word marijuana stem from the racist policies of these laws?
Well, absolutely, because if you look at the history in America, you didn't see the word marijuana used before the 30s. Up until then, we always called it cannabis. But when they wanted to ascribe the use of marijuana to Mexican immigrants, then they started using the Spanish term marijuana.
It's really embarrassing if you think about it, because we're a country that stands for equal justice for all, and yet that's not the message that we're sending to our communities with the way that we enforce our marijuana laws.
Al Capone and his gangster buddies weren't shooting each other with machine guns because they were drunk on the alcohol they were selling. They were shooting each other because of the profits associated with the distribution of alcohol, who gets to sell in what neighborhoods. And that in many ways mirrors a lot of the drug problems we have today. It's not the drugs themselves that are causing the violence. In fact, with marijuana, the most damage someone's going to likely do is to a bag of Doritos. It's a counterintuitive solution. That is to say, being tough is not the same as being effective, and very often it's the opposite of being effective. And so I liken the problem of prohibition to those Chinese finger cuffs, right? The straw tubes. You stick your finger in, and the tighter you pull, the more you pull, the stucker you get. And it's counterintuitive that the way to get out of this mess is to relax a bit, and then the cuffs come off.
To learn more and to obtain a free copy of the informational booklet, Marijuana, It's Time for a Conversation, please visit marijuanaconversation.org. You know, we've been talking about all the tax dollars we're spending to enforce marijuana laws and all the harms that flow from marijuana prohibition, but we haven't talked about the health issues. So we met with Dr. John Morgan. He's a physician and professor of pharmacology. He spent his career teaching a generation of medical students about both the helpful and the harmful things drugs can do.
As an interested physician pharmacologist, I became very much taken by the fact that cannabis was analgesic, relieved pain. It lowered the likelihood of nausea and vomiting in cancer chemotherapy. It relieved muscle cramps in people with multiple sclerosis. It increased appetite. It helped AIDS patients both in gaining weight and having a better appetite and treating their nausea from antiretroviral drugs. The most dangerous thing about marijuana is to be arrested for its possession or use. That's more harmful to individuals than any pharmacological, toxicological, or other harm. We need to have the conversation in part because people need to deal with a truth, which is that marijuana is one of the most safe psychoactive components that people have ever ingested. And even though there's a moral opposition and a fear that your children are going to become monsters because they use it, the data and the discussion indicates that the compound is largely safe. And in areas in which it's dangerous, prohibition is doing us no good. And we need to talk about the real issues of this drug and not these pretend issues which the government continues to raise and frighten people with.
We've had a chance to hear from our panelists and from experts in the field. And now I'd like to hear from our audience members.
I agree the marijuana policies aren't working and are doing more harm than good, but I worry about our kids.
Sure, we all do. My wife and I have 2 teenagers, and I don't want my kids using marijuana any more than I want them drinking alcohol or smoking tobacco. I need to speak honestly with them because I want to have credibility with them when I talk about drugs and drug abuse. Our children know that drugs can be dangerous, and they know that drugs are not for kids. But if my kids experiment with pot, and they might, I don't want it to ruin their futures. As a parent, I'm concerned that because marijuana is illegal, our kids can be targeted by anyone willing to make a quick buck selling it to them on the streets.
You know, it's crazy that we spend billions of dollars arresting people, but kids still have no problems finding marijuana.
But government studies have shown that to be true. Most teenagers find it's easier to buy pot than to buy beer or cigarettes. And that makes sense if you think about it. Legitimate businesses know that if they sell alcohol to kids, they can lose their license. So they don't. And you know what? In the states that have decriminalized possession of small amounts of marijuana, as well as those that have medical marijuana laws, usage rates have not gone up among minors. In fact, in the Netherlands, where adults can buy pot in licensed coffee shops, significantly fewer teens smoke marijuana than in the United States. Recent studies conducted in both countries showed 28% of Dutch 16-year-olds have tried marijuana, compared to 34% here in the United States. By the way, no one I know in the United States or in Europe is advocating allowing minors to smoke pot. Concerned parents here and there love their kids, want to be credible in their eyes, and many want to take the crime out of the equation. These are important issues to be thinking and talking about. I'm concerned that our nation's war on drugs has created an atmosphere where people are afraid to talk openly about the issue. Fear should never keep us from advocating the reassessment of a law we believe is causing harm to our society. And if fear is keeping people quiet on an issue of such importance to our children and neighborhoods, I think it's flat out good citizenship that we speak up. I hope all of you in our viewing audience will continue the conversation. How our society treats marijuana is a complex issue. There are no easy answers. One thing is very clear. Our current marijuana policy affects millions of lives, costs billions of dollars year after year, and it's just not working. If we raise the level of discussion beyond simplistic hard-on-drugs or soft-on-drugs rhetoric, perhaps we can come up with a policy focusing on pragmatism and fairness. And then we can be smart on drugs. I'm Rick Steves. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation. To learn more and to obtain a free copy of the informational booklet, Marijuana, It's Time for a Conversation, please visit marijuanaconversation.org.